In this video, I want to go over some criticisms that Kripke levies against descriptivism. So we'll go over two versions of what is known as the semantic argument against descriptivism, and we'll go over what is known as the modal argument against descriptivism. So whether version 1 or version 2 are trying to establish is that the referent of a proper name is not going to be linguistically determined by a Phrygian sense or a descriptive content that is uniquely satisfied by an individual. In order to do this, what Kripke does is he provides examples in which we use names of popular figures, and it seems like we're successful in using the names of these popular figures, even though one may misidentify a specific description that we associate with the name, or of the person who the name is supposed to refer to, or in other cases, we seem to successfully use a name to refer to an individual, even when we don't actually have a description in mind. So, for example, take the name Albert Einstein or Einstein. Many individuals believe that Einstein is the father of the atomic bomb, and it's primarily because people, for some reason, think that he was the person who led the Manhattan Project. Let's assume that there's an individual named Bob who learns of the name Albert Einstein via the description Einstein was the father of the atomic bomb. Thus, whenever whenever Bob thinks of Einstein, he associates the description the father of the atomic bomb. Right. So every time he asserts any sentence that has Albert Einstein's name, right, as the sense of Albert Einstein, what is expressed is the sense that would be expressed by the father of the atomic bomb. Now, according to Phrygian descriptivism, it is the sense, the father of the atomic bomb, that is going to determine the referent of the name Albert Einstein, right? So in Bob's language, the referent of the term will be whoever is the individual that uniquely satisfies the description, the father of the atomic bomb. So whoever happens to be the father of the atomic bomb. But if you look into the history of the creation of the atomic bomb, it wasn't actually Albert Einstein who was the person who led the Manhattan Project. It was Robert Oppenheimer. So what this entails is that the name Einstein refers to Robert Oppenheimer in Bob's language. But of course, that's ridiculous. When we use the name Einstein, even if we get this historical fact wrong, we're not intending to refer to Oppenheimer, we're intending to refer to Einstein. But what Phrygian descriptivism entails is that because the description is uniquely satisfied by Oppenheimer, the name Einstein refers to Oppenheimer. So something has gone wrong here, and what Kripke concludes is that descriptivism must be false because of this. In the second version of the semantic criticism, Kripke presents an example in which we are lacking, or an individual would be lacking a proper description that would uniquely pick out an individual. So there is no description in mind that would uniquely pick out an individual for which the proper name is being used for, but for which nevertheless we would assume, or it really appears that the name is being used successfully. So take the name Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman was a famous physicist, and let's suppose that Bob learns that Richard Feynman is a famous physicist, and this is the only fact that Bob knows of Richard Feynman. So whenever he's asked, who's Richard Feynman, he answers, a famous physicist, right? So when we look at the description that is associated with the name Richard Feynman, or the description that Bob associates with Richard Feynman, it appears that, no one's going to satisfy that description, because surely Feynman wasn't the only physicist who has ever existed, right? So what this entails, according to descriptivism, is that the name Richard Feynman doesn't refer to anybody whenever Bob uses it. So if Bob says the phrase Richard Feynman is a famous physicist to answer the question, who is Richard Feynman? Well, clearly that sentence has a meaning, and clearly the name Richard Feynman seems to successfully refer to the physicist Richard Feynman. But under the descriptivist view, the name wouldn't refer to anyone, because this is the only descriptive association that Bob has in mind when using the name Richard Feynman. So again, What descriptivism is suggesting or entailing is that given that there is no description that would uniquely pick out Richard Feynman, whenever Bob uses the name Richard Feynman, it doesn't refer to anybody. But of course, we can see that Bob would be using the name correctly, so therefore descriptivism must be false. And again, according to both of these versions of the semantic criticism, the reason descriptivism is false is because descriptivism is stating that the referent of a proper name is determined by the sense or descriptive content that is expressed by that sense that we, again, associate with the name in question. And given these two examples, right, these two examples demonstrate that no, we can successfully use proper names when we misidentify a particular fact or historical fact that we associate with an individual, when we misidentify that, or even when we have no description in mind that we can use to associate with the individual in question. We can still successfully use proper names, and this seems to, again, suggest that it is not the sense or the descriptive meaning associated with names that determines the referent. It's going to be something else. Therefore, descriptivism has to be false under these grounds. The next criticism that we're going to be looking at is what's called the modal criticism. And we've already kind of alluded or touched on this criticism in the last video. So essentially what this criticism states or levies against descriptivism is that it claims that definite descriptions that are associated with proper names will sometimes fail to pick out the referent of the proper name in counterfactual situations or when the name is used in modal sentence. So, in order to see this, suppose that Bob associates the following description with the name Richard Nixon. He associates the description, the person that won the 1968 presidential election, right? Well, take the following two sentences. Sentence number 1, Richard Nixon was the person that won the 1968 presidential election, and sentence 2, the person that won the 1968 presidential election was the person that won the 1968 presidential election. According to descriptivism, the following would be entailed. Take sentence 2. Sentence 2 is a necessary truth, right? Sentence 2 is true in every possible world. Whoever won the 1968 presidential election was the person who won the 1968 presidential election. Well, given that sentence 1 and sentence 2 are synonymous, then that would entail that sentence 1 would also have to be a necessary truth. But of course, when we look at sentence 1 doesn't strike us as a necessary truth. I mean, in fact, it's not a necessary truth. How do we know that it's not a necessary truth? Because it's clearly possible that somebody else could have won the 1968 presidential election. We've already talked about it. Humphrey could have won the 1968 presidential election, right? So while sentence 2 is a necessary truth, sentence 1 is not a necessary truth, because in counterfactual situations, it's possible that someone other than Nixon would have won the 1968 presidential election. Nevertheless, whenever we use the term Nixon, even to evaluate or to assert counterfactual situations, we're still referring to Nixon. We're not referring to some other individual. We're not referring to Humphreys when we use the name Nixon. Therefore, it has to be the case that descriptivism is false. So again, according to the modal criticism, descriptivism is false in that when we use proper names, if we are assuming that proper names have as their meaning a Freudian sense or a descriptive content, well, then we don't seem to, or we wouldn't be able to seem to properly assess counterfactual sentences or modal sentences within this framework, because there will be times that when we're evaluating a counterfactual situation, we wouldn't be referring to the individual that is of interest, right? So in this case, when we say something like, let's say use the sentence, it's possible that Nixon could have lost the 1968 presidential election, or it's possible that Nixon was a billionaire, right? Well, if we're associating the descriptive content, the person that won the 1968 presidential election, then according to descriptivism, we would fail to be referring to Nixon. But of course, Nixon is the person of interest. Richard Nixon himself is the person of interest whenever we are asserting or evaluating counterfactual situations. So descriptivism seems to fall apart here according to this analysis.